All right, Shalom Aleichem, Erev Tov, welcome back. So tonight, unlike the other Ḥachamim that we've done so far, who each had books that we were able to learn from, and that is something that is integral to this class, tonight I chose a different type of Ḥacham. He has no books out, but his leadership style and the historical context is so compelling that I still want to talk about him tonight. And I think by the end of the shiur, you're going to agree with me as well. Now, for those of you in the class, as well as online, if you'll notice in our Google Classroom, as well as in the WhatsApp message, you should have a packet that we made today. I want to thank Ḥacham Yonatan for helping me put it together. So you're able to pull that up, I believe, in the classroom. Yes? Okay, as well as on your phones. If you look at the...
It should be titled... The name of the rabbi is a PDF.
Okay, so it's going to be a PDF, and you're going to see it says Ḥachamim. On the bottom is Ḥacham Salman Ḥogi Abudi. Now, if that sounds like a mouthful, it is. Now, you have here a picture of an Iraqi Ḥacham. Though this picture, he doesn't look like an Iraqi Ḥacham. He looks like he came from Poland, and I'll share with you in a little bit why. But let's first talk about who he is, what era he spanned, and what is significant about his leadership style that I think we should take away from here. If you go to page 4, Ḥacham, either Suleiman or Salman, I'm going to call him Ḥacham Salman. He was born in 1894 in Baghdad, in Iraq. He died Chaf Hei Adar, which is coming up on Shabbat, in year 1973. His parents were righteous, holy people in their own right, Ḥacham Yitzchak and his mother Rima. And he was born into a city, think of Torah giants. So when we talk about certain locations, and if you can, look at map number 3. Sometimes we talk about cities where Jews were and weren't, and we're trying to carbon date them, right? When did the Jews get here? Very often you'll meet Iraqi Jews and they have a lot of pride in where they come from. And it's not for no reason. The Iraqi community is of one of the oldest Jewish communities that we have. What do I mean by oldest? Elchana, you were talking to me about the Fertile Crescent? Yeah? Remember Avraham Avinu, the founder of Judaism, the father of the nations? Where does he come from? He comes from a place called Ur Kasdim. He eventually makes his way down to Canaan much later on. But if you look at the ancient maps, you'll see Ur Kasdim is in that Fertile Crescent where Mesopotamia is. It's what we would consider today modern day Iraq, Iran, that whole neighborhood. Tell me when the Jews go back. So when do they head back to Iraq? Don't get thrown off by the name. When do they head back to Bavel, to Babylon?
After the exile of the second temple being destroyed. First temple.
Yafeh, right? The first temples that we just had Purim. So we just had Purim. The Jews are in Persia. How'd they get to Persia? It's a trick question. Really, they got to Bavel, and then Bavel was taken over, right? But we're talking about the history of the Jewish people in Bavel is thousands of years old. We're coming to the end of that. So this Ḥacham lives in that cusp where the Jewish people went from thriving in Iraq to overnight feeling we are no longer welcome. We no longer belong. Our 2,000 plus years of history in this place has so radically shifted. Let's get on to the next flight and go back home. What happened? So let me walk you through a little bit of the history. Now, Ḥacham Salman starts off, if you look at the map, in the city of Baghdad. So if you see in the middle, it says Iraq. Move a little bit northeast. You're going to circle over there the city of Baghdad. That's the capital. His family, he goes to one of the most famous yeshivot called Bet Zilcha, which would like to date itself back to, if not the original, in the spirit of the original yeshivot that were set up there, known as Surah and Pumbedita. Very good. Not the band Pumbedisa, but Pumbedita. And we're talking about real Jewish academies. We're learning theology. There's a reason the Jews didn't leave when Ezra and Nehemiah came to get them. And it wasn't just because they had beautiful homes and real estate was cheap. The infrastructure of the Jewish community in Bavel was magnificent. So that's where he learned. Now, who did he learn with? Think of names like Ḥacham Yehuda Fataya. For those of you who don't like to sleep at night, remember the books from Ḥacham Yehuda Fataya? Ruchot, what's the word? Ruchot. Misaprot. Ḥacham Yehuda Fataya was a Kabbalist par excellence. And he has a whole entire book of all the spirits that came to talk to him and the dreams. It is one of the books I do not recommend you read at night. But this is one of his teacher's contemporaries and ultimately one of his very close friends who he's buried next to in Har HaZeitim much later on when he dies on the Mount of Olives. They're buried right next to each other. You have Rabbi Shimon Agassi. For those of you who recall, Ḥacham Yonatan gave a class. I don't know if it was ever recorded. Ḥacham Shimon was a very special Talmid Ḥacham. What do I mean very special? Unlike other rabbis, he was not dependent on the community for his parnasah, for his money. And therefore, he was unafraid to rebuke them in ways that no other Ḥacham gave rebuke. He talks about them copying the French and copying the English and falling prey to all those politicians who want the community to be swayed in one direction. He is extremely sharp in his words to the Jewish community because he can be. You then have other Ḥachamim like Ḥacham Shimon Mordechai, Ḥacham Tzadka. He grows up in this community. He's learning until 1914. In 1914, we have to take a break because from 1914 to 1918, what happens in the world? Take a lucky guess. We have World War I. World War I. Very good. At this point, Iraq was under the Ottoman Empire. And if you recall, I told you in a different class, what was the name we called the Ottoman Empire? He was called the sick man of Europe. Why the sick man of Europe? Because the Ottoman Empire was falling apart from all its ends. You see, when you become too greedy, eventually, if you stop conquering at a certain point, then you say, this is my capacity. This is how much I could handle. It's good. But it never happens that way. The Ottoman Empire kept expanding. It was getting too old. It was getting too big. And eventually in 1914, it gets dragged into the war. At this point, the Jews in Baghdad are very worried because the Ottoman Empire wanted to bring them into the war as well and conscription. So what happens is, Ḥacham Suleiman's parents, Rabbi Yitzchak and Rima, send him off to a city known as Batzra. Now, where's Batzra? I'm going to show you on the map. Okay? So travel with me all the way southeast. The map is on page 3. From Baghdad, we're traveling southeast to the border of Kuwait. And then a little bit further. Really, it's the border of Iran. You'll see a little city, Basra. So the city of Basra is interesting because it had already a flourishing Jewish community that was under the leadership of Rabbi Yecheskel Sasson, or Sassoon. Rabbi Yecheskel Sassoon was in very, very good relationships with the government over there, and then later on the King Faisal I. What it did was it helped. It helped that you had now a bunch of young boys, primarily, who were coming all the way from Baghdad, running away from the conscription. He was able to take them in to set them up with families so they could eat, they could drink, they could settle, and they could also give back to the community. When Ḥacham Salman came there, he said, I don't want to just take, I want to be an asset to the community. What could I do? I could teach. I'm a teacher. He sets up a yeshiva there, and until the war is over, he stays. He stays, the community flourishes, but ultimately he wants to go home. He wants to go back to the city of Ḥachamim, and when the war is over, at this point, the borders already have shifted. The Ottoman Empire fell. We're going to have later on the British coming in, though we have the Mamluk dynasties. Okay. He comes back to Baghdad. He comes back there. And if you look at the bottom of page 4, I just want to show you the progression of Ḥacham Salman's making his way up his ladder in the rabbinic world. So if you look at the bottom of page 4, you have in 1923, he was elected to the Vad HaRuchani, the spiritual committee, and he was appointed as part of the Beit Din. Now, it's not like today, where in order to be part of the Beit Din, you have to be somebody corrupt who knows how to coerce people and hurt them in ways that only the ruffians who work in the Beit Dins do. A Beit Din was once a serious place of Talmidei Ḥachamim. So in 1923, he's appointed to the Beit Din. In 1928, just 5 years later, they see in him somebody, and his group really called him the Ari Shebachabura, the lion of his group. Both because of his intellect, but even more so because of his midot. And continuously throughout the stories you hear about him, the humility he had, the ability to lead the people, but also from the people. They put him as the Av Bedin, the chief Bedin in 1928. And as the chief Bedin, Bavel and Israel are always really sister cities. So if you'll notice, if you look at the map, the borders all the way to the west are what we have today, modern day Syria and Jordan, but those are new countries. If you move a little bit off the map, what you don't see, that's where Israel is. And there's constant flow between those two communities, again, dating back thousands of years. The Chachmei Bavel and the things that the Chachmei Israel had to say about each other, very sharp, not always nice, but the relationship was constant. In 1930, he comes, he pays a visit there. Now, this is, again, years before, right? A decade plus before the founding the State of Israel. But unlike what the lies the world likes to tell us, we had a thriving, albeit maybe small, but we had a Jewish community there. Yeah, in the 1930s, there were Jews in Israel, many Jews in Israel. And he goes, he visits, and ultimately he comes back. He's recruited back, this time not just as the chief, the Av Bedin, but as the chief rabbi of the city of Baghdad. Now you have to understand, this is not a small-time city. It's not like he got elected to be the governor of some kind of island. This is a major metropolis, an extremely powerful position. Because ultimately the chief rabbi is also not just the chief rabbi in a halachic sense, but really a liaison to the rest of the world, to the government, to the agencies that provide the finances, the funding. That's his position. I believe at this point he's maybe in his 30s. So think of maybe 34, 35. For those of us who've passed that age, I don't want to ask you what you were doing at 34 and 35. I can tell you I was not appointed at 34 or 35 to be the chief rabbi of Baghdad. He becomes the chief rabbi in 1947, Mechila. Now, what is it that makes them say, this is a person we want for leadership? So really, it's something that happens 6 years earlier, 1941. What happens in 1941? So if we said the World War II was from 1914 to 1918, we have a little break. And then when does World War II start? So World War II starts in 1939. Yes? 1939 until 1945. And World War III, no, chas v'shalom. So, right? We have 1939 to 1945. Now, for whatever reason, when we record history, we tend to not always record it accurately. What do I mean? One of the great misnomers is that the Ashkenazi Jewish community is the only one that was hit in the Holocaust. Now, I'm chas v'shalom not taking away from the suffering, the atrocities, the incomprehensible destruction that happened. It's simply inaccurate that it was only Ashkenazi communities that were targeted. And I will show you now a case in point. The Nazis had no intention to stop. It's not like they ended the war because they sat down and had a meeting and said, it's really not nice what we're doing. Let's stop. That's not how the war ended, right? The war ended because they were defeated. Had they not been defeated, the plan was, we know that Rommel Yamach Shemo was on the way to Israel. Operation, I believe it was Desert Fox, where he was heading towards Israel. The goal was to conquer Israel and all the Middle East. At this point in history, the Arabs, specifically the Mufti of Yerushalayim, Yamach Shemo, his name be cursed, was in very tight cahoots. We have pictures of him sitting in meeting with Hitler, planning already what does the future look like without a Jewish nation, right? So the hatred of the Jews did not start with the founding of the State of Israel. It's a nice lie that we keep perpetuating until it feels like the truth, but it's not true. The Arab leagues and the Arab nations and their leadership had every intention to join on with the Nazis to help with a final solution. So much so that it's either 1941, 1944, 1943. Why do I say that? Because the historians have it differently. The Nazis came and took over Bosnia. So think Bosnia, Croatia, Herzegovina, that neighborhood. Again, originally Ottoman Empire. states. They took it over and they formed the 23rd Waffen. They were known as the Mountain Soldiers. They were Bosnian, but they were Muslim. So if you ever see pictures of Nazi soldiers and they're wearing fez hats, it's not a mistake. It wasn't Purim. It wasn't Halloween. It was because they were actually Muslim. They were recruited because they were joining on to the Nazi party. And this infectious disease spreads to Iraq too. Now, at this point, really the British have control over Iraq. But really they don't. Because before them, they were the Mamelukes. There were other tribes. And I think sometimes we underestimate the nature of the tribes when we transpose other kind of forms of government. So it doesn't matter who the government was. There's a word I'm looking for. The allegiance. The allegiance of the Iraqi people was not to the British and it wasn't to the French. It was primarily to their own tribal leaders. They didn't like the British at all. And in 1941, we have what's known as the Farhud. Have you heard of the Farhud? No. Why not? Yeah? Okay. You've heard of Kristallnacht? Yeah? Great. It's the same thing. It's just the Iraqi version. Okay? So if you know what happened on Kristallnacht?
They came and broke the glass and they arrested people and broke in the schools and stuff.
Very nice. What does Kristallnacht mean?
The breaking of the night of the glass.
Yeah, the night of glass breaking, right? What happened was the Jews lived under this illusion that Europe was forever going to be good for the Jewish people, so much so that Germany was considered the new Jerusalem. And then on Kristallnacht, they very quickly learned that it's not true. In just one night, that whole illusion was broken with the shootings, not shootings, but the lootings and the breaking of the Jewish stores and the desecration and the mobs that were filling the streets. Very quickly, that dream shattered. You have the same thing happening here in 1941, where there's chaos between the Iraqi government, the British, and for a brief moment in June, precisely June 1st and 2nd, you have the Farhud breakout. What does it literally mean? It means pogrom. Think of a pogrom. The pogroms, I'm listening now to a podcast on the Middle Ages. So it happens to be talking about the Crusades. Right, you hear about Pope Urban II, 1096, 1290. And it's incredible to hear the speeches that the popes were giving to the people, which was, our goal is to get to the Holy Land. But you're going all the way from West Europe, crossing all the villages that there are Jews. And the promise that the popes made to them was, you have free range. Go into those villages, loot, kill, steal, murder, rape. And that's what the Crusaders said, yes, sign me up for that. It always boggles my mind that Ashkenazi Jewry even survived, let alone thrive, because the chaos that went on is something abnormal. This is what happens. Now you have to understand, for the Jewish community, this June 1st and 2nd coincides with the holiday of Shavuot. So here the Jewish people are going to the Batei Knesset in their Shabbat clothing. Everybody's off. They're all centered in one place. They're coming to Tefillah. They're leaving Tefillah. And in the interim, all kinds of crazy chaos breaks out. Now, myth has it, they say that there was a shmuah, a legend on the street that somehow a Jew had shot an Iraqi soldier. It was later verified, lo haya, lo nivra. It never happened. It never was. But it was enough of a reason for the Iraqi locals to say, yalla, now that there's chaos, the government is dismantled, there's disarray, let's take these next 48 hours and go out into the streets and massacre and loot and trample and desecrate. And that's exactly what they did. And by the time they were done with this in 2 days, and the British did come back and get a little bit of a stronghold, we have an estimated of 180 Jews who are dead. Young, old. They say the atrocities they committed will remind you of October 7th. That's the kind of animalistic behavior they saw on the streets. It's in this scene that Rabbi Salman comes out into the streets and he says, it's true, it's Shavuot, but how could I let my people be massacred without at least being there for them? How could I let them die while I'm going to be holed up in some wall waiting for this to pass? And he goes out into the streets, and body by body, he identifies, this is a Jew, we need to bring him, we need to do a tahara, we need to bury them, we need to tell the family. And this is really where Rabbi Salman becomes extremely beloved by the community, because his actions were one of, I could hide, I could run. In fact, he reminded me of the words of the Piasetzner Rebbe. The Piasetzner Rebbe, Hashem Yimkon Damo, he died, he was murdered. He and his entire family were murdered in the Holocaust. And he has some very sharp words. This is not me saying it. He has some very sharp words. His book was actually translated by Rabbi Dr. Forgive me, who is the dean of Turo? Dr. Henry Abramson. He did a phenomenal job translating the book's Esh Kodesh into English. And if you'll read in those pages, he really indicts the rabbis that left their communities during the war. He said, how could it be that you got up on Hoshana Rabbah, and he's talking about a specific rabbi. He says, you told your whole community to stay. You told community to have faith. You told community that God will help. And then you left that building, you shaved your beard, you got yourself a train ticket, and you ran for your life to safety. He said, what kind of leader are you? And again, the Piasetzner Rebbe, till the very last day, stayed with his Hasidim. He had numerous opportunities to leave. Forgive me, Chevra, I have a little bit of a cold. It's the gift that never stops giving when you send kids to school. Right, Rosie? Yeah, we know. He had many opportunities to leave. In fact, we have the Chassidut that I come from, Karlin. So the Stolner Rebbe's grandfather, Rabbi Yochanan, was found in a DP camp. You know what a DP camp was? It sounds nice. It sounds like a summer program. It's not. It's DP stands for displaced person. After World War II, nobody wanted the Jews. You would think that after the war, everybody should open their arms and say, we're so sorry. No, the answer was, please, keep the Jews away. So no, what do you do with all the unwanted people? They put them in displacement camps until somebody would come and retrieve them. And there was a Jew in New York who was very active in helping the Jewish community get out. His name was Mike Tress. He came to one of these camps and he sees Rabbi Yochanan, the Stolner Rebbe, with his daughter, then later on Rabbanit Dr. He said, I don't understand. You had connections. Why didn't you get out? In fact, he was in the United States and then went back to Europe during the war. And he told them the same answer. He said, what kind of a leader would I be if I abandoned my people? You find over here that same spirit with Rabbi Salman. Rabbi Salman says, my people are suffering. I'm going out to the streets. And ultimately, they later on, just 6 years later, they crowned him as the chief rabbi of Baghdad. Now, this event is what really historians debate, but I don't believe there's a debate of whether or not this was the turning point in Iraqi history. Because you don't find that in 1941, if this happened in July, you don't find a mass exodus. You do find, though, the sentiment of the Jewish communities were no longer welcome. What was for thousands of years a safe haven, a place that Jewish communities thrived, suddenly it didn't feel that way. Yes, sure, there were neighbors who took us in, and there are always going to be stories about good people because there are good people everywhere. There are good people everywhere. But the overall sentiment is our time here is limited. The Jewish community no longer feels safe. We need to figure out alternative plans. And as soon as those plans are available, what was once a community, we're talking about 250,000 Jews in Iraq, ends up being decimated to a number that doesn't even count. And I want to talk to you about that. What's that? So what happens after that the Jewish community leaves? So tell me what happens between 1941 and 1951. Oh, yes, in 1948, that's what happens. Yeah, so we're going in order of history, 1948. Right? In 1948, Israel declares itself a state. And at that same time, all the neighbors bring their homecoming gifts. No, they don't. All the neighbors around us declare war. Right? We have the War of Independence. The Jewish people win. We have a state. What happens over here is, if the Jewish communities were okay, and I'm saying okay very neutrally, because it was never great, but they were okay in the Arab nations, with the founding of the State of Israel, that shifts very, very rapidly. How rapidly? In 1951, the Jewish community of Iraq feels that their time here is really limited. And they start planning with the help of both Israel and tremendous donors from the United States. I read a number, and I feel like it's not accurate because I'm thinking that it should be much higher. But they estimated about 4 million. I think it's for sure more. But 4 million of the dollars that were used in Operation Ezra Nehemiah, or sometimes known as Operation Aliyah Baba, don't ask me why, American Jews realized even if we can't be there to get them onto the boats and smuggle them to Cyprus through Iran, we need to help our families. We need to help our fellow men because very quickly the tide is turning. Very quickly the sentiment of this is a safe haven no longer exists. And in 1951, we have the mass aliyah. Now, for those of you who remember, we just read the Megillat Esther. Why do you think they name Operation Ezra and Nehemiah? What happens? Yafeh. Because after the story of Purim, we have both Ezra and Nehemiah saying, Chevra, if you didn't get the message the first time, they don't want us here. Right? Ḥacham Yonatan just told us a joke. Yeah, when was it? Yesterday he told us a joke. They said there was a guy who came there was a Jewish guy. He landed in a city and he wanted to pray Shacharit. He looks around, there are no synagogues. But he sees in the corner there's a church. He says, okay, I'll go into a church. It's also a house of prayer. He comes in. He didn't realize it's Sunday morning. Over there, the pastor's giving a speech. It's silent. Everybody's listening. And he's busy standing there with his talit and tefillin. And it's making the pastor really, really uncomfortable. And at a certain point, he stops in the middle of his speech and he says, I'm going to ask that, please, all those all the Jews, please leave. And it gets silent. And this guy, without missing a beat, instead of walking out the door, he walks up all the way to the front. He picks up the statue of Yeshu and he whispers into his ear. He says, Bubala, they don't want us anymore. Come, let's go. And he walks, right? I think that's what we have over here. It's Ezra and Nehemiah telling the people, they don't want us here anymore. But the Jews don't always get the message. Interesting fun fact. Now, I can't tell you if, I don't know, do the Jewish people believe this as well? Remember the yeshiva the Ḥacham Salman sets up in Batzra? He names this yeshiva Yeshivat Ezra because at least the Muslim community believe that is where the tomb of Ezra is. Now, I don't know. I did not have time to do enough research if we believe the same thing. But for sure, the sentiment of Ezra lived here in this neighborhood, in this location, somewhere there. So what happens in 1951? In 1951, they do a rescue. Who? The Israelis. They do a rescue through Iran, out through, if you remember last week's map, you note Iran, and then you go further, let's say northwest, you end up in Cyprus, and then they brought them down to Israel. How many people? Hundreds of thousands. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Jews come. And where do we put the Jews? So we put them in what we know today as ma'abarot. Ma'abarot. Now we're going to stop a minute and talk about what are these ma'abarot? Who were they built for originally? What purpose did they serve? And what is it about Ḥacham Salman that makes him so unique? So I want to read to you about what really these ma'abarot were. Now, ma'abarot is a Hebrew word. It has the shoresh ayin bet resh, la'avor. What does la'avor mean in Hebrew? Yeah, to cross over. The ma'abarot were transitional camps or transit camps. They were supposed to be kind of like when my grandparents came to the United States in the late 1800s. The first stop they came by boat. They lived in Rhode Island, but where did they come first to? Ellis Island. They came to Ellis Island. For those of you unfamiliar, if you're ever in New York, it's just really a boat ride away. It's a fascinating place to visit, Ellis Island. Ellis Island is where they put all the immigrants. Now, first they would check them to make sure they had no diseases and all kinds of, if they were poor and if they came from certain ethnicities and a lot of different testing that they didn't necessarily tell you what they did there. And if they passed that. So, for example, when my grandparents came from what today would be Ukraine, their last name was Lieblein Bistritsky. Right? If you thought Salman Ḥogi Abudi was a mouthful, Lieblein Bistritsky was the name. But when they came to Ellis Island, the clerk who was working there said, that name's too long, pick a few of the letters. And just like that, Lieblein Bistritsky somehow became Biston. It happened, right? But Ellis Island was somewhere, now you should know there were some immigrants, particularly those who the United States did not want, that would remain stuck there because it was this middle ground. Nobody wants you, not your country of origin, and certainly not the country that you're trying to enter. The Ma'abarot were originally supposed to be a very temporary stop for the new immigrants. And they have to understand, Israel's founded in 1948. They're dealing with mass emigration. Okay, so we're talking about 1945. We have tremendous emigration, and I should say not enough. Not enough. What do I mean not enough? One day, on your time, you're going to read a book called Perfidy. Perfidy is a book written by Ben Hecht. For many, many years, it was banned from being sold in Israel. In Hebrew, the book is called Kachash. It is a story about the Kastner trial. I met somebody whose mother was on that train. If you don't know what I'm talking about, good. I'm giving you some homework. When I say not enough, I mean not enough, because really there could have been that many more Jews from Europe. Had those who were part of the founding of the State of Israel agreed and wanted, thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of more Jews from Europe could have emigrated alive. Not like dead ashes, but they didn't. Like I said, that's another chapter in history you're going to do some research on. Perfidy by Ben Hecht. Yes? Okay. But you have an influx of, after the war, Jews coming. You then have, again, all the Jews from the surrounding countries. So think about the Syrian, the Lebanese, the Iraqi, the Persian, the Moroccan. Anywhere that there were Jews are now coming to Israel. And they're like the IRS. They know where to find you when they need their money. But when it comes to processing, they're like 10 years, 12 years, 12, 50. They couldn't do it. Now, what ends up happening very quickly, though, is this becomes a very bitter part of Jewish history. Very bitter part of Jewish history, of racism, of classification, of how all people matter, but some people matter more than others. And I want to read to you a little bit of an article about these Ma'abarot. So you don't have it, but if you would like to, you can find it on any search engine. It's titled Ma'abarot, Israeli Immigrant Transit Camps Revisited. It was actually just published. So, not just, we're ready. It was published in 2024. And this is by Hila Shalem Baharad. Okay, it's a revisiting of our stories of the Ma'abarot and how the government wants to tell us that it looked like. It's not in your source sheet. It's something I'm reading to you. So originally we have that the Ma'abarot were really transit camps. And initially they were what we called homotopic transit camps. From the camp's establishment in 1950 through 1951, in this period, the transit camps accommodated immigrants from 16 different origin states. The camps were located in Israel's center, mainly between Gadera and Hadera, and were ethnically heterogeneous, meaning you had the Polish and the Yemenite, and you had the Iraqi and the Romanian and the Ukrainian and the Lebanese. Everybody came there. That was from 1950 to 1951. The heterotopic transit camps, so from 1952, after the removal of the Ashkenazi immigrants from the camps, all the way until 1954, in this period, the camps were primarily inhabited by Jewish newcomers from Arab and Muslim countries, and they were located on the outskirts of existing localities, spreading to Israel's geographic periphery. So no more in the center, much more on the outside, the outskirts of where the established communities were. And they were no longer heterogeneous, correct. And then the last one. The development trends, amazing. They called him the persistent heterotropies, the development transit camp. So now it's no longer about displacement and temporary, but starting from 1954 through the late 1970s. That's a long time to keep people in a waiting room. In this period, all transit camp residents were Mizrahim, mostly from North Africa, and placed in designated neighborhoods, development towns, and peripheral localities. So what started off as a place where all immigrants came, very quickly was sifted out to only specific neighborhoods and specific types. And this was not by mistake. And I want to read to you, if I can, a few quotes. So we have some interviewees who lived in the transit camps during this formative period testified that the departure of the Ashkenazim significantly changed their lived reality. More than half of them described in detail the short period during which Ashkenazi immigrants, they vanished. So somebody with the initials SA recalls that Iraqis, Yemenites, and many Romanians lived together in his transit camp. After a year or two, the Romanians just disappeared. They just disappeared. J.A. spoke of the moment he realized that only immigrants from Iraq remained in his transit camp. Quote, he says, the Romanians disappeared from there, and the Polish disappeared from there. Suddenly, there was not one who was not Iraqi. TB said, we got a big tent, and ultimately, we were upgraded to shacks. The Ashkenazim disappeared long before us. They got housing units. A.S. shared, we wanted a normal life, and we were stuck in the transit camp. They started building houses nearby, and only the Ashkenazim got them. We spent 6 years in the transit camp. Now, you have to understand, this isn't people who were a bunch of homeless Bedouins who decided to come. We're talking about established community members who are coming from thriving Jewish communities. For those of you who have not yet read the book, I highly recommend. Zvi Zohar has a book on the creativity in the Middle East, where he talks about the universities, the language arts, the sophistication of not just the Iraqi community, but its surrounding neighborhood Jewish communities that was light year ahead of its other neighbors. And suddenly they come to Israel, and they're treated not like first-class citizens or third-class citizens, but as no-class citizens. And if you look, unfortunately, into much of the redacted, for many, many years, there were many classified files in Israel. And forgive me, I speak lightly because I know that we're in a time where the whole world is already picking on us. So what I say is an internal critique, not for the world. We have a lot of internal reckoning to do. A lot. And if things had changed, I wouldn't talk. But we still live in a world where racism, where differentiation based on external factors is real, is true. And unfortunately, much of the leadership in the founding of the State of Israel were very honest about their feelings towards what they considered their new label, the Mizrahi Jews, the brown Jews, the Jews of color. And it wasn't by mistake that the Romanians and the Polish disappeared from these transit camps and the Iraqis stayed. Now you're talking about, again, people who were coming from, it's not post-Holocaust survivors, from established communities. Life was flourishing. They were wealthy. They made a choice to come to Israel, only to be thrown into some kind of shack, some kind of tent. The language, they used to make fun. They used to call the Ashkenazi people the Vuzvuzim. What's the origin of that name? Maybe they said when they had these, the microphones that you speak into, you can't hear a thing. So in the transit camps, the predominant language that those who ran it spoke was Yiddish. So they would say vus and ven and vi and viazoi. But to the ear that wasn't trained to hear Yiddish, the only thing they heard was vuz, 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 vuz. So ultimately they renamed the Ashkenazi Jews as the Vuzvuzim. But the sentiment was, and it wasn't hatred towards Ashkenazim. I want to read a quote. The LD, huh? It is a derog. Yeah. Okay, I don't personally take it as an offense. Really? Yeah. But I've heard it used not, for sure, meaning not as a, is it considered like a flank?
Maybe. It depends who, right?
Depends who.
Like Harapels won't let us.
For example,
he won't let us say yekes either. He thought it was an offensive word to me.
That's very interesting. Hey, Yochanan, is being called a yekka offensive? I think it's a compliment. They think it's a compliment. Maybe everyone else thinks it's an insult. I don't know. It's interesting. Maybe I don't know. No, ethnic names. You should know, though, the hatred was not pointed to the Ashkenazi community by the Sephardic world as much as to the leadership. So, for example, LD testified. Avinam, can I get more water, please? What time did I start? And what time do I end? I have time. Yeah, okay. He says, our Romanian brothers lived with us in the transit camp. After a few months, suddenly, these dear brothers of ours disappeared. We thought they were taken to prison. I mean, our assumption was, what turned out? They were moved to a housing project nearby, and quietly, at night, they moved them. Meaning this was all a scandal, because it wasn't done, with the right government paperwork, and it was hush, hush, hush at night. And suddenly, one clear day, the transit camp became a fully Iraqi one with no Romanians. Of course, we were not against our Romanian brothers getting housing. But why should they get housing and we don't get housing? We should have gotten the housing jointly. The sentiment was not a complaint against the Ashkenazim getting upgraded. Simply, why are we be treating less? Why are we considered worse? If I could read one more. He says, suddenly, people who were in the same class as us, people who went to work and came back and worked hard, suddenly they had the option to buy a flat and other places. Now, I mean, it's not that people felt they didn't deserve it or anything like that, but it changed the demographic of Israel at that time. And there's more. There's some very interesting videos. I believe there's one on YouTube. It's called Ma'abarot. It's very sobering to watch, but I do recommend it. It's important. It's important to know our history, because even if history doesn't repeat itself, it certainly rhymes. And the crimes that we do, if we don't talk about them and we don't call ourselves out and we don't make it something that we consciously want to fix, we default back to it. That's how it works. Now, in this mess, so you find that this Ḥacham Salman comes with his community, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Jews, and like his people, he gets put into a camp. He gets put into a transit camp, and they give him a job from the Keren Kayemet L'Israel. They say, you have 2 hands, you have feet, you look like an able-bodied person. We're giving you a job. Say thank you. What is the job they give him? They make him go out into the sweltering fields to start picking oranges, to start clearing the rocks from the soil. Ḥacham Salman, the chief rabbi of Baghdad, the one who is busy writing letters across the world to different halachic responsa, has now been reduced to a field worker. Now he's busy picking oranges in the orchards, and he's taking out rocks and stones from the ground of Israel. Now, if you've ever done any labor in the fields, it's hot, it's sweaty, it's back-breaking labor. It's certainly not what a chacham is meant to be doing when he has the intellect and capacity. And yet when they found him here in the field, and Moshe Chabusha is, who's Moshe Chabusha? Elchanan. Moshe Chabusha is one of my favorite chazanim. He was also Ḥacham Ovadia Yosef's favorite chazan. Whenever Ḥacham Ovadia Yosef needed somebody, he would call him up and said, come Moshe, come, we're going to do a chafla, we're going to do a party, you're going to bring out your oud, and you're going to sing. Moshe Chabusha recently wrote a book, and in it he records, he says, when they came to Ḥacham Salman, and they said, Ḥacham Salman, it doesn't make sense, it's not mechubad, it's not respectful that somebody of your stature should be working such a job. What did Ḥacham Salman tell him? He said, what do you mean? I'm now in Eretz HaKodesh, I'm in the Holy Land, I'm able to get my hands dirty with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's soil. What greater honor and privilege could I get than to be doing this work? And it wasn't that, yeah, sure, if you have protexia, please get me out. This is the greatest honor. But his community members did not feel the same way. They said it can't be. It can't be that the Talmid Chacham, who carried our generation in Baghdad, should now be over here in the Ma'abarot. And they ultimately helped get him out and move him to Petach Tikva, where he became he became one of the rabbis over there. He became very close to the chief rabbi, Chacham Cohen. No. Ruvain. That's why I said Cohen. I'm thinking Katz. He became very good friends with him, so much so that when Rav Reuven Katz's wife passed away, he was called to give one of the eulogies, which are recorded. Beautiful, beautiful eulogy he gives on the Rabbanit and what she did for the community and how she really shouldered the burden of Am Yisrael so her husband, Harav Katz, could do the rabbinic side of things. He then is moved on from Petach Tikva to Yerushalayim. From Yerushalayim, he makes his way up to the Batei Din, where he becomes part of the Rabbanut and really becomes influential like he was back in Baghdad. But as he's climbing back up this ladder, he doesn't forget about Achenu Kol Bet Yisrael. He doesn't forget his brothers. And he goes from one ma'abara, from one transit camp to another, to visit them, to give them chizuk, to speak to them. And if you can, look with me on page 10. He writes a letter that is so stirring, and I want to read it with you. And this is why I chose to talk about him today, because of this letter. You find a lot of times when people, when they shift leagues, the first thing they want to do is sell out the people that they were originally close to. Oh, she's not really related to me. Oh, I don't even know that. What do you mean you don't know them? We grew up together. We're from the same village. We used to eat with our hands together in the mud. No. Now I'm upper class. I'm different. I don't want to be associated with the people that I came from, lest they ever think I'm one of them, lest I lose my prestige. It's very embarrassing. You should know it's very embarrassing for me when people are so embarrassed of their own identity that they have to sell themselves. They sell their people out. It's a whole nother level of ugly. But over here he comes, and look at, he says, in his first opportunity, he goes to the Mabarot, and he writes an assessment of what he saw. Let's read it together. You know what? I have it in English, so let's read it in English so we can all get it. But I want to read in Hebrew first because the words will remind you of a different leader in Am Yisrael. He says, התפקיד הראשון שהטלתי על עצמי בתור הרב הראשי של העיר הגדולה בבגדד. He said, the first duty I imposed upon myself as the chief rabbi of the great city of Baghdad was לעבור בין המקומות בהם שוכנתם, to travel among the places where you, my people, dwell. אתם אנשי קהילתנו, my people, the people of our community, ממעברה למעברה וממקום למקום, from one transit camp to another, from one place, wherever my people, we all just came on this mass exodus with Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. I want to go see my people. להיות צר לי בצרתכם, because I wanted my pain and your pain to be together. לראות בסבלותיכם, to see in your, to witness your suffering. לעודדכם ולאמצכם, לחזק את לבבכם באדוני אלוהי ישראל, כי שעה גדולה היא. He said, I'm here, and now that I was able to put myself on my own 2 feet, my primary responsibility is to go back to my people. וירא בסבלותם. Tell me where in the Tanakh you know those words from. ויגדל, ויצא אל אחיו לראות בסבלותם. Who is that character? Okay, now I'm going to say it in English. And he grew up. Tell me the name. And he went out to see me? Moshe. יפה, Moshe Rabbeinu, right? It says, ויגדל Moshe grew up. ויצא אל אחיו, and he goes out to his brothers, וירא בסבלותם, and he goes to not just see their suffering. If you look at Rashi, the commentary over there says, what did he go out to do? נתן עיניו וליבו להיות. I say Meitzar, but you corrected me last time that it was different. Nikud Alehem. He goes out and he says, I'm in the king's palace. I have a very cushy job. I'm okay. But how could it be that if my brothers are suffering and they are toiling and they're doing back-breaking labor, I'm going to sit inside? The single mark of leadership is the ability to be connected to the people all the time. Not just when things are good. To the contrary, when things are good, nobody needs you. It's when things are so bad to have the ability to say, I'm not jumping ship. I'm staying here. I'm with you. I'm a part of this. And these are the words that are echoed in Rav Salman. He says, I need to lirot besivlotechem. It's literally the same wording that Moshe Rabbeinu uses. He says, I'm coming back. I finally got myself onto my own 2 feet. I can breathe a moment, but what is my breath worth if I'm not coming back to my people? Let's read. He says, and what do I see? What did I see on my rounds? I saw the great sages and communal workers, the dayanim and the rabbinic decisors, scholars and men of action, neglected and abandoned to their fate, as if they were raw material to increase the population count and nothing more. He says, I'm going from one camp to the next, and my heart is shattered, because the people that I knew yesterday to be the leaders and the fabric that made the Jewish community what it was, they're nothing. They're just another body. They're just another person that you could put into the field until they drop dead. As if they had no past and they had no present, as if they were not counted amongst those who could contribute greatly to the spiritual and practical absorption of the masses of immigrants. He said, I'm observing something abnormal. You have here leadership that has the capability of taking all these aliyot, all these mass migrations, and establishing them properly in Israel so the communities can seamlessly be transplanted and continue to thrive. And instead of seeking out the leadership, what have you done? You've just thrown them into the corner, silenced them as if they don't exist. They are rolling in the dust in remote tents. The elderly have no one to care for them and are dying of hunger and thirst. And the talented young scholars, capable of filling important rabbinic and public roles, are waiting in line for heavy manual labor that is beyond their physical capacity. There's a midrash that tells us one of the craziest things that the Egyptians did was that they mismatched the labor to the person. So normally you go for a job, they ask you what makes you qualified. Because if you're not qualified for the job, aside from that you're going to do a terrible job, it's one of the cruelest things to give a human being a job that they're incapable of doing. He says, here I'm observing all the talent of Am Yisrael, not just going to waste, but being abused. I saw my brothers and sisters starving for bread, tormented and downtrodden. I saw their idleness and confusion, and I was shaken. Is this not a time to act? Can we not also benefit from this aliyah in building the land and the state? He comes with a very big indictment, and I'll tell you in a minute to who. Why are they neglected and abandoned to the arbitrariness and charity of bureaucrats who look upon them as inferior people and discriminate against them in every way? It is a great wonder regarding the leaders of the Babylonian and Sephardic communities in the land that they did not rush to help them. I heard the cries of the wretched women, and my eyes shed tears. He said, here you have nations that were uprooted and have finally come home after 2,000 years of galut so that we could come back home to thrive, to rebuild, to flourish. And what am I seeing? I'm seeing all the talent, all the dayanim, all the aristocrats of society, amongst the others, being tormented, being mistreated. And the bureaucrats, I didn't have much hope for. Because anybody in the hands of the bureaucrats, we already know would suffer. He turns to the Sephardic community that existed prior to the state of Israel. He says, where are you? Before I start complaining to the other people, I'm turning to my own brothers and sisters. Iraqi Jews are not new to you. We've been friends prior to the state of Israel, prior to 1948. We've been in correspondence for almost 3,000 years. Why is it that now when we came in mass, you turned your shoulder like we're strangers? Shouldn't you have been the ones who stood there with the pitchers of water and bread and the dates and opened your homes and opened your hearts? And he takes it upon himself to really be an activist. If not actively politically, speak up. He wasn't afraid to speak. He wasn't afraid to say, I don't care which position I do get and which position I don't get. But if my people are going to suffer, and Esther, I'm thinking about you. Because I'll tell you why I'm thinking about Esther. Can I embarrass you a minute? Esther, many, many years ago, before she lived here, Esther was part of a union. Yeah? Because there was groups, literally, of workers who were being so abused without any voice. Because how could they have a voice if you don't even have a passport and a green card? So what kind of voice could you really have? And because people know that, they will always take advantage of you. Because hanging over your head is the noose of, well, if you don't listen to me, I can very quickly make sure you disappear. And I remember seeing the pictures and the videos of Esther, who told me, I don't even speak English, but it's not true. Esther made waves. And waves, because that's what true leadership is. Because if I'm not going to use my voice, and I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to fight for people's rights, and I'm going to fight for the underdog, because the person on top never needs you, then what are you worth? And this is what Ḥacham Salman dedicated his life to. Whether it was in 1914, the Jews of Batzla, or in 1941, the Jews who just experienced the Farhud, or in 1951 up until 1973 when he passes. He wasn't afraid. And you should know this courageous attitude made him some enemies, don't think. So much so, he once went into a Bet HaKnesset. So, a little history. He was very, very good friends with Ḥacham Mutzafi, back from Iraq. But when they came to Israel, they split paths. They didn't split paths rabbinically, but politically. Ḥacham Mutzafi really became part of the ultra-Orthodox camp, the Eda HaCharedit. Ḥacham Salman did not. He became part of the Rabbanut. So think of the Israeli Jewish Zionist group. But they remained best friends. So much so that every time Ḥacham Salman came to the synagogue of Ḥacham Mutzafi, who was his senior, Ḥacham Mutzafi would always stand up, get out of his chair, move over so Ḥacham Salman could take his place. Every single time. Now, one time when he did it, one of the radicals, the zealots in the Bet HaKnesset got up and he started yelling, "What is this? This Ḥacham Salman, he's a kofer, he's a heretic." And Ḥacham Mutzafi looks at him and he said, "Are you going to get between the love of ish l'rayato, between a husband and his wife? Are you going to get between the love of family? Who cares about politics? So he sits with the Rabbanut and I sit with the Eda Charedit. So what? Before we were politicians, we were family. Before we ever came to the shores of our own homeland, we used to drink from the same wells in the Bet Sefer of Zilcha. That's not going to change who we are." They said another story about him, if I'm telling you about a Bet HaKnesset. He was a Dayan. And one of the people who was the Gabbai in the Bet HaKnesset had a Din Torah. And he didn't like that Ḥacham Salman ruled against him. Ḥacham Salman had decided that he was the one who was in the wrong and he has to pay money to the other person. So when he called up Ḥacham Salman to the Torah, instead of giving him a Misha Berach, he started to say the Hashkava that you say for the deceased people. Hanan, how does it start? Very good. He started instead saying like a yahrzeit. Yeah, for his anniversary, he started saying Ha Merachem HaKol Birota, pretending like Ḥacham Salman's dead. And the community went silent. They didn't know where to bury, literally, no pun, they didn't know where to bury themselves. Ḥacham Salman came up, he made the blessing on the Torah, and afterwards he goes over and he says, "Thank you. Everybody needs Rachamei Shamayim. Me, you, everybody." And just like that, he went to sit back down, unfazed. And this is how he lived his life till the very last day, where he was in his Bet HaKnesset, Or Rachel. For those of you familiar with Yerushalayim, it's in what's known as the Mekor Baruch neighborhood. So think of where the shuk is, one neighborhood before, on Rehov David Yelin. That's where his synagogue was. And he was in the middle of giving his Shurei Torah when he passed away. And he passed away, we're talking about, with thousands who attended his funeral. And not because of the books he left behind, but because the character of strength of what leadership looks like. And he wasn't alone. This didn't come from nowhere. If you can, look with me maybe at source 12. If you'll notice, there's a picture on page 12. So unlike the first picture where Ḥacham Salman had already adopted the attire that the rabbis in Israel wore, which was predominantly Eastern European, in this picture you find Ḥacham Salman is number from the right. Count with me, 1, 2, 3, 4. He's wearing traditional Sephardic garb. Ḥacham Salman didn't come from nowhere. Ḥacham Salman came from a world of giants, of leaders who understood that with a title came a mission. And more than the accolades and all the dignity that was given, really was public service. Because when you say, "I want to be a public servant," it's not an honor, it's an obligation. It's an obligation to lead the people through the good times, through the bad times, through the transitions, through the highs, through the lows. That's a Ḥacham. That is somebody who deserves the title Ḥacham. And I think that's something for us. I think that's something for us that very often we're looking for leadership. And our Ḥachamim tell us, שבמקום שאין איש, תשתדל להיות איש. In a place that there's no man to do the job, you be that person. And I think today, the Navi tells us, Hen am lo alman, that we're not a nation of orphans. And I think sometimes today we do feel that way because we look at our leadership and we say, what kind of leadership is this? One is more corrupt than the other. We're not sure if their heads were screwed on the wrong way or there is no head screwed on at all. And I'm pushing us to say, okay, so stop looking so much at the leadership and let's start looking at ourselves. Let us become these leaders that when a community is going through a crisis, we stand up. That when a community is being displaced and hurt and banished and broken, we stand up and say, how do I help? How do I make it better? Because to complain, everybody knows how to complain. To come and get the awards, everybody knows how to do that. You don't need to be a leader. But to be a leader like Ḥacham Salman, who learned from Moshe Rabbeinu, it's somebody who goes out and vayar b'sivlotam, sees and recognizes that this is the moment that I have to step up. Because if I am not going to step up, like Mordechai tells Esther, if you're not going to step up, what's going to happen? Revach v'hatzala yamod l'Yudim mimakom acher. Don't worry, God will never abandon his people. There will be others who stand up. But you know who's going to lose out? V'at ubet avicha tovedu. You will lose that moment in history where you could have made a difference. Where you could have been the one to say, wow, you're the next leader of Am Yisrael. And I'm looking at all of us. I'm blessing us all. If there was no opportunity like today, the leadership has such a huge vacuum on a micro level and so much bigger. And I'm pushing us to say, let's stop being Jewish. Let's stop kvetching. You know what a kvetch is?
Complain.
A kvetch is what Jews do best. They say there was once a waiter who comes over to a table of old Jewish ladies and he brings food and at the end he says to them, is anything good? Because we like to kvetch. So I'm telling you, stop being Jewish and start being real people of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Be'ezrat Hashem, when we're going to step up to the plate, I promise you, Ata takum terachem Tzion ki et lechenena kiva moed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will say, you stepped up to the plate, I'm stepping up to the plate, and Be'ezrat Hashem, we will be going Letzion Berina, minus the Mabarot. Until then, Chevra, I want to wish you a beautiful day. Thank you so much for learning with me. And a Shabbat Shalom when it comes.